The story I want to cover here today is another story that's taking a look at the way the media functions and the way they essentially change all of the wording. Some of you, I'm sure, have read George Orwell's 1984. If you have not, you should, because in George Orwell's 1984, a lot of people talk about the surveillance cameras and the totalitarian state. That stuff was all interesting, but the most profound and interesting concept, I think, in 1984 is how the censors work to remove words from people's vocabulary. Because if you can remove words from people's vocabulary, you narrow the language and you can funnel people towards the conclusion you want them to have by simply denying them the language they need to express the truth. This, I think, is the most powerful concept that Orwell details, and details beautifully. Now, Margaret Atwood is a writer. If you haven't heard of her, you're lucky. Her books aren't great. I've tried to get through A Handmaid's Tale a number of times. I say this as somebody who has enjoyed a lot of very leftist, progressive type dystopian books. So it's not that I have ideological differences with her, which I do. It's just I think it's a badly written book, and I don't think it's nearly as good as other books that are trying to do the same thing. And so Margaret Atwood, of course, has been at the forefront of sort of the anti-Trumpian resistance, predicting what she thinks is going to be some sort of Christian fascist totalitarianism. And so there was a great article published on May 12 in The Guardian. And it's another great example of the Orwellian use of language to drive people towards a conclusion that is defied by the actual facts. And considering the fact that she's a writer, there's a kind of disturbing irony in what Atwood's doing here. So the headline is, Margaret Atwood says she cannot remember another time when words themselves have been under such threat. Now, I too feel the same way. Let's see if we agree on virtually anything. So Margaret Atwood says, words are our earliest human technology. Like water, they appear insubstantial, but like water, they can generate tremendous power, the 85-year-old novelist said in her acceptance speech for the Freedom to Publish Prize at the British Book Awards, because progressives have had such a hard time getting their books published over the last couple of decades. Spare a moment for all of the left-wing novelists who have struggled in obscurity rather than getting their books published, especially this particular author who is, what does the article say? Right, receiving yet another award for her books, most of which talk about the fascism that progressives are far more likely to wield in this day and age. But back to Atwood here. Political and religious polarization, which appear to be on the wane for parts of the 20th century, has increased alarmingly in the past decade, she said. The world feels to me more like the 1930s and 40s at present than it has in the intervening 80 years. Now, why does she say that? Because I will say that there are aspects of our current period that do feel like a very dangerous time period before significant events take place. So I've talked a lot about the rise of anti-Semitism. I do think that social media's total democratization of speech has created all kinds of interesting problems for institutions. And then, of course, the subsequent collapse of the credibility of institutions, which we just discussed in the last segment on Joe Biden, have contributed to that. When you have a collapse of faith in institutions, the rise of anti-Semitism, yes, there are some eerie echoes of past periods going on here. But Atwood is not referring to that. Atwood is saying that she herself, as a progressive who has written a book, The Handmaid's Tale, most famously, which has been produced into a wildly popular TV show, into a number of different seasons, that she herself has been the target of some oppression. And one almost gets the sense that she wants to kind of cosplay as a writer persecuted for her work, as opposed to a writer receiving yet another award. So she said she's honored to be receiving the award, but unlike so many writers, publishers, and booksellers, both in the past and today, I have never been imprisoned. True, but wait for it, though I may have to revise that statistic if I attempt to cross into the United States in the near future. Now, this is genuinely humorous because Margaret Atwood obviously takes herself incredibly seriously. She was in the States all the time as a producer on a major TV show, but now she thinks because she wrote a dystopian fictional book about a Christian totalitarian state that doesn't contain any Christians, certainly not of any kind of doctrinal belief that would be recognizable, that again is being made into a TV show, final season, premiering at some point near you this year, that she's going to be at risk of arrest. Why? Well, let's delve back into her also fictional story. I have worked as a writer and in my youth in small press publishing for 60 odd years. Those years included the Soviet Union when samizdat was a dangerous method of publishing. Hand-produced manuscripts were secretly circulated and bad luck for you if you were caught. They've also included the recent spate of censorship and book banning, not only in oppressive countries around the world, but also in the United States. They have included, too, the attempt to expel from universities anyone who disagrees with the dogmas of their would-be controllers. Now, the fact that Margaret Atwood thinks that heading into the United States is going to get her arrested, the author of, Heather's Pick at a Chapters Near You, is somehow comparable to the samizdat manuscripts being published by those who were living under Soviet rule, is genuinely hilarious, but there's something more insidious going on here. And there's an irony baked directly into her speech because she said, a recent spate of censorship and book banning in the United States. Now, what is she talking about? Well, what she's talking about is a debate currently going on across the United States and very recently at the Supreme Court of the United States about whether or not school boards can make the decision about which books to include or not to include in the curriculum or the school libraries. Now, to emphasize here, every individual school decides what goes in their school library and what doesn't go in their school library. And obviously, what books are considered worthy of inclusion have a lot to do with your moral values, because people who think the innocence of children should be protected obviously don't want books that that discuss LGBT ideology in school. And in fact, again, this was recently a discussion at the Supreme Court of the United States, where we were treated to the bizarre sight of Supreme Court justices asking why books like Pride Puppy were in any way appropriate for preschool or kindergarten. And if I had to guess, I think the Supreme Court is probably going to side with the parents who advocated for their right to decide what books children are exposed to in public schools. But what the left has brilliantly done during all of these book debates, essentially these are debates about whether or not sexually explicit or politically charged material is appropriate, and if it is appropriate, at what ages is it appropriate, with different sets of parents and different school boards and different states making different decisions on that. And instead what they've done is they've called it censorship or book banning. And they're doing this because it kind of harks back. When you think of book burning, you think of the Nazis, right? This is immediately what you think of. Book banning, the Nazis banned books. They had blacklists. They had book burnings that were overseen by propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. We've all seen black and white photos of big piles of books burning at night while the young wolves of the Hitler Youth chucked armloads of forbidden authors onto them. And I've been to Berlin, where they actually have a glass window set into the cobblestones, and when you look through the window, all you see are empty bookshelves. And the bookshelves are carefully calculated to represent the number of books that were burned on that pile. And so when they're saying book banning, they're using a trigger word that will automatically make people think of the Soviet Union, of Nazi Germany, of totalitarian regimes where a majority of books are actually forbidden. Or censorship, where they're saying you are not allowed to read this information, or we're going to put out Book A, Book B, Book C, but we're going to remove anything that the government doesn't like from those books. Now, this is the definition of gaslighting, because almost the opposite of what Atwood claims is actually taking place. So first, we're not talking about book banning. You can order one of Atwood's badly written books right now by going on to Amazon.com or .ca or anywhere in the world, and you can have that book on your front doorstep tomorrow. That includes anywhere in the United States of America. You can order Pride Puppy. You can order the book about I Am Jazz. You can order all kinds of pretty horrifying books with very sexual, explicit material for any teenager in your life that you know. But the debate here is not about banning any book, because no book is being banned. This is about whether or not schools, school boards, parents have the right to determine what books their children are exposed to in school libraries. What books are public libraries funded by the government paying money to supply to children? That is the actual debate. So Margaret Atwood is lying here, which makes it so ironic that at the beginning of her speech, she said she can't remember another point in her lifetime when words themselves have been under such threat, because she is using words in this context to deliberately deceive her audience. Same thing with censorship. Nobody is censoring the book Genderqueer. They're just suggesting that children and teenagers shouldn't be going through a graphic novel that shows them what gay oral sex looks like. They're not censoring it. They're not providing the book with the explicit squares, black blacked out with black construction paper or Sharpie felt. No, they're just saying that book should not be available to teens as in supplied by the school. If the parents want to order that book from their teens, they're free to do so, because not only is the book not censored, it's also not banned. But what they're doing here right now is trying to make those who think the innocence of children should be protected, that they somehow are akin to Nazis or totalitarians, because they don't want their taxpayer dollars supplying sexually explicit books to their children in a state school. And again, every single school decides what goes in their curriculum. You can only put so much material in a curriculum, and libraries only have a certain amount of space, and the budgets are only of a certain size. So every single school decides what they should or should not put in, and there are judgment calls to be made. And what Margaret Atwood is basically saying here is that your judgment call, if you disagree with her, is very akin to Soviet totalitarianism, even though she's engaging in the Orwellian practice of twisting words and using trigger terms to disguise what is actually taking place to herd her listeners or her readers to a certain conclusion. So this is really gross stuff from Margaret Atwood, and I'm not surprised, but you can tell she seems to be having some sort of identity crisis in her old age, because she would like to think that she lives in a world that is not entirely dominated by her worldview, that she doesn't live in a Western world where all the things she has spent her life advocating for actually do dominate the cultural narrative. Instead, she wants to pretend that if she crossed the border into the United States, and if she does so, it's probably because she's getting another award from some abortion rights group, that she's going to somehow be arrested, which is just ridiculous. And to give you one other example of just how ridiculous this is, Margaret Atwood is a big defender of transgender ideology. Now, transgender ideology, again, has resulted in the perversion of language that has forced words into the mouths of people who don't want to use them. Jordan Peterson was famously persecuted because he didn't want to use preferred pronouns, because he said this was essentially compelled speech. You cannot force me to use my words to affirm your ideology, even if you truly believe that ideology. But Margaret Atwood has weighed in on these fights, and of course the opposite end of that fight is being led by another famous writer, J.K. Rowling, who has said, "I will not speak words I know to be lies." But Atwood weighs in by saying things like, "We say non-binary people are non-binary, trans women are women, trans men are men, trans rights are human rights." So in other words, trans women are women, males who say they're women are women. Women who say they're men are men. And this is the woman who is worried that words are under attack in our current day and age. You couldn't get a better irony than a feminist writer who affirms gender ideology, who affirms that trans women are women, that affirms the creation of all these new pronouns that didn't exist when she started writing her own books, claiming that she's going to get arrested if she goes into the United States, the country that is currently producing a long and onerous television miniseries on her most famous book, for which she has been widely praised. And her reason for saying she'll get arrested is because of book bans and censorship, when ironically, neither of those are taking place. So that is one of Canada's greatest literary Illuminati. And I hope you all enjoyed her speech at the receipt for yet another award, where she cosplays as a dissident from totalitarianism. Thanks so much for joining us on The Bridgehead today. If any of you have any stories that we should cover, please drop a comment below. If you have any vigorous disagreement or heckling you'd like to do, please drop those comments as well. You can find our content wherever you download your podcasts. And if you found this content helpful, please do share the video or like it. Thanks so much for listening.